The diamond tennis bracelet hit the marble floor of the Tribeca penthouse with a sound like shattering ice. Vanessa Cole's perfectly contoured face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable as she screamed at the man she claimed to love. Broke? What do you mean broke, Luca? You promised me Monaco in July. You promised me the villa. From the doorway of the nursery, Eloise Bennett froze, a sleeping 2-year-old cradled against her soft, generous chest. She had seen many things in her 3 years working for the Moretti family, but she had never seen the woman of the house show her real face. Until tonight. And standing 15 feet away in the shadow of the grand staircase, his dark eyes locked on Vanessa like a wolf studying a wounded deer, Luca Moretti was watching too. He had just told the most beautiful woman in Manhattan that he had lost everything. It was the most expensive lie he had ever told. And it was about to cost his girlfriend her entire future. Luca Moretti was 36 years old, 6'3", and the undisputed head of the Moretti crime family, the oldest and most feared of the 5 families that still controlled the bones of New York City. He had inherited the throne at 29 when his father took 2 bullets to the chest outside a social club in Bensonhurst. In the 7 years since, Luca had tripled the family's holdings, laundered hundreds of millions through a legitimate construction empire, and built a reputation as a man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The threat lived in his stillness. He wore charcoal 3-piece suits cut by a tailor on Savile Row, drove a midnight blue Aston Martin DB12, and lived in a 4,000-square-foot penthouse on Hudson Street where the windows looked out over the river like a fortress wall. He had a daughter named Sophia, 18 months old when her mother died of an aneurysm in a quiet hospital room 2.5 years ago. He had a girlfriend named Vanessa, a former runway model from Greenwich who had moved into the penthouse 14 months ago and started leaving suggestions about engagement rings in the Sunday paper. And he had a nanny. The nanny's name was Eloise. She was 29, a size 18, and the only person in the entire penthouse that the great Luca Moretti actually trusted with his daughter. Eloise Bennett did not look like the women who orbited Luca Moretti. She was soft where Vanessa was sharp, warm where Vanessa was polished, full-figured where Vanessa was carved by a personal trainer who charged $400 an hour. Eloise had thick honey blonde hair that she usually kept in a low practical braid, wide gray-blue eyes behind tortoiseshell reading glasses, and a heart-shaped face with a dimple in her left cheek that appeared whenever Sophia made her laugh. She wore soft cardigans and high-waisted jeans and sneakers that could chase a toddler across a marble floor without slipping. She had a master's degree in early childhood development from Columbia, a specialty in trauma-informed care for bereaved children, and a salary that Luca paid her in cash because he didn't want her name on any paperwork that could connect her to the family. He had hired her 2 months after Sophia's mother died, when his daughter had stopped speaking entirely and refused to be held by anyone who smelled like perfume. Eloise had walked into the penthouse in a soft oatmeal sweater that smelled like vanilla and laundry detergent, sat down on the nursery floor without saying a word, and within 10 minutes Sophia had crawled into her lap and fallen asleep. Luca had watched the entire thing from the doorway, and something in his chest had quietly cracked open and never closed again. He had buried it. He had a girlfriend. He had a daughter who needed stability. And Eloise was an employee. A brilliant, irreplaceable, devastatingly kind employee whose entire life revolved around making sure his little girl felt safe in a house full of ghosts. So Luca did what mafia bosses do when they want something they cannot have. He pretended it did not exist. For 3 years. What made it worse, what made it almost unbearable some nights, was that Eloise was kind to Vanessa. Genuinely kind. She did not see the woman of the house as a rival, because Eloise Bennett did not understand the concept of being a rival to anyone. She understood her job. She understood Sophia. When Vanessa swept through the kitchen in the morning complaining about the espresso machine, Eloise would quietly fix it. When Vanessa hosted her thin, glittering friends in the great room and asked Eloise to bring out a tray of canapés, Eloise would do it without comment, even though it was nowhere in her job description. Luca had watched it happen 100 times. He had watched his girlfriend treat the woman he secretly loved like a piece of furniture, and he had not said a word, because saying a word would have meant admitting what was happening inside his own chest. He hated himself for that silence. He had hated himself for it for 3 years. But mafia bosses, real ones, the ones who survive, do not act on feelings. They act on information. And the information he had about Eloise had always been the same. She was too good for him. She deserved a life that did not involve burner phones and basement meetings and the constant low-grade fear of a federal indictment. So he had buried it, and buried it, and buried it. Until the day Carmine walked into his office with a manila folder and gave him a reason to finally start digging it up. The trouble started on a Tuesday in early March, when Luca's underboss, a 60-year-old wolf named Carmine Bellucci, walked into his office on Pearl Street and sat down without being asked. Carmine had served Luca's father for 30 years before serving Luca. He had no fear of his boss, and the boss knew it. "Lou," Carmine said, sliding a manila folder across the burled walnut desk. "We have a problem. And you're not going to like it." Luca opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Vanessa, in a hotel lobby in Midtown, exchanging a thick envelope with a man in a gray suit. Vanessa, on a burner phone in the parking lot of a Whole Foods in Chelsea, her face tight with concentration. Vanessa, sitting across from a federal prosecutor named Daniel Hayes at a corner table in a cafe in Brooklyn, leaning forward, talking. The dates on the photographs spanned 6 months. Luca looked at them for a very long time. He did not move. He did not blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Carmine had to lean forward to hear him. "How sure are we?" Carmine exhaled. 90%. She's been seen with Hayes 3 times. The envelopes look like cash. We don't know what she's giving him, but we know she's been in your office at night when you're asleep. The cameras catch her looking through your desk. Luca closed the folder. His hand was perfectly steady. Inside his chest, something old and cold was waking up. "I want to be 100%, he said. "Before I do anything." Carmine nodded slowly. "What are you thinking, boss?" Luca's dark eyes lifted, and for the first time in the conversation, something dangerous flickered behind them. "I'm thinking," he said softly, "that a woman who's selling me out for money will show her real face the moment the money disappears." Carmine sat back in his chair. A slow, grim smile crept across the old wolf's mouth. "You're going to fake it." "I'm going to fake all of it," Luca said. "Bankruptcy. Federal seizure. The works. I want her to think I've lost everything down to the watch on my wrist. And I want to see what she does next. And if she runs straight to Hayes. Then I'll know," Luca said. "And I'll handle it." There was a long pause. Then Carmine, who had known Luca since he was a boy chasing pigeons in the courtyard behind the social club, said the thing that no one else in the family would have dared to say. "And the nanny, Lou. Eloise. What happens to her in all this?" Luca did not look up. His jaw tightened, just slightly. "Eloise stays out of it," he said. "She doesn't know anything. She doesn't need to know anything. She takes care of Sophia. That's all." Carmine studied him for a long moment. Then he stood up, picked up the folder, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Boss," he said without turning around. "You sure you're testing the right woman?" And then he was gone, leaving Luca alone with the question he had refused to ask himself for 3 years. Luca sat at his desk for a long time after Carmine left. The afternoon light through the office windows turned the color of weak tea, then bronze, then the deep blue of early evening, and he did not move. He thought about the first time he had ever seen Vanessa Cole, at a charity gala at the plaza, in a silver dress, laughing at something one of his capos had said. He had thought, at the time, that she was the kind of woman his father would have wanted him to marry. Beautiful. Polished. Born to money. The kind of woman who would look correct on his arm at fundraisers and at his side in the obituary photo, 60 years from now. He had pursued her the way men in his world pursued women, with restaurants and jewelry and quiet shows of power, and she had moved into the penthouse 14 months ago with 6 suitcases and a small dog that Eloise had ended up walking. He had never once asked himself if he loved her. He had asked himself if she was suitable, which was a different question, and one his father had taught him to value more. And then he thought about Eloise. He thought about the night, 2 months earlier, when Sophia had spiked a fever of 104 at 3 in the morning, and Luca had come home from a meeting in New Jersey to find Eloise in the bathroom, in pajamas, sitting on the tile floor with his daughter wrapped in a wet towel against her chest, singing very softly. She had not heard him come in. He had stood in the bathroom doorway and watched her, and he had felt, for one terrifying second, that he would burn every dollar he had ever earned for the right to sit down on that floor beside her. He had walked away from the doorway. He had gone to bed next to a woman who had been photographing his desk drawers for 6 months. And he had told himself, again, that he was protecting Eloise by not looking at her. He understood now, sitting alone in his office at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in March, that he had not been protecting her. He had been protecting himself. And he had nearly gotten his entire family killed in the process. The plan moved fast. Within 72 hours, Luca's lawyers had drafted fake bankruptcy filings on letterhead that looked identical to the real Southern District of New York court documents. His banker, a man who owed the Moretti family his entire career, agreed to freeze the joint account that Vanessa had access to and to send her a polite, devastating letter explaining that all assets were currently under federal review. Carmine arranged for 2 black SUVs marked with fake FBI plates to sit outside the penthouse for an entire afternoon, just long enough for the doormen to gossip. And on a cold Thursday evening in the middle of March, Luca came home and sat his girlfriend down on the white leather sofa in the great room and told her, in a flat, exhausted voice, that the federal government had seized everything. The construction company. The accounts. The cars. The penthouse was next. He had maybe 30 days before they had to move out. He didn't know where they would go. He didn't know how he would pay her credit cards. He was, he said quietly, completely and totally finished. Vanessa did not cry. That was the first thing Luca noticed. She sat very still on the sofa, her long, tanned legs crossed at the ankle, and she stared at him with an expression that was trying very hard to look like shock. But Luca had spent his entire life reading faces in dim rooms, and he saw the calculation happening behind her green eyes. He saw her mouth tighten. He saw her hand drift unconsciously to the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. And he saw her ask, in a voice that was just slightly too controlled, "What about the jewelry, Luca? The pieces you gave me. Are those mine?" That was the moment he knew. He didn't show it. He just rubbed his face with his hands and said, in a voice cracked with manufactured grief, that yes, the jewelry was hers. She could keep it. It was probably all she would have left. Vanessa nodded slowly, stood up, and said she needed a moment. She walked out of the great room toward the master bedroom. The moment the door closed, Luca heard, very faintly, the sound of her phone unlocking. And then, even more faintly, the sound of her voice. Low. Urgent. He could not make out the words. But he did not need to. He stood up, walked across the great room in his socks, and stopped at the doorway of the nursery. Eloise was inside, sitting in the rocking chair by the window, reading to Sophia from a worn copy of Goodnight Moon. The lamp on the dresser cast a warm gold light across her round cheek and the soft swell of her chest where Sophia's small head was pillowed. She looked up when she sensed him in the doorway, and her gray-blue eyes met his, and something in her face changed. She had been crying. Quietly. Without making a sound. Because she had heard, through the door, every word he had said to Vanessa about losing everything. And Eloise, who had no idea it was a lie, was already trying to figure out how to keep working for him for free. That was the moment Luca Moretti understood that he had spent 3 years lying to himself about which woman he loved. "Eloise," he said softly. She closed the book, smoothing her hand over Sophia's hair. I heard, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Luca. I won't leave Sophia. Whatever happens. We can figure something out. I have some savings. Her voice cracked on the word savings, and Luca had to look away from her, because if he kept looking at her he was going to do something he could not undo. Eloise, he said. I need to talk to you. Tomorrow. After Vanessa leaves for her appointment. Can you meet me in my study at 10? She nodded. He turned and walked away before she could see his face. Vanessa did not sleep in the penthouse that night. She told Luca she needed air and left at 11 with a small overnight bag. The doorman, who had been instructed by Carmine to report her movements, watched her get into a black town car and gave the plate number to a man in a parked sedan across the street. By 2 in the morning, Carmine called Luca and told him, in a voice grim with confirmation, that Vanessa had checked into a suite at the Mandarin Oriental and that Daniel Hayes, the federal prosecutor, had arrived 20 minutes after her. Luca thanked him and hung up. He sat in his dark study for a long time, staring at the river through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he did not feel rage. He felt something much colder. He felt clarity. He walked through the silent penthouse at 3 in the morning. He walked past the master bedroom, where the bed was empty, the sheets still folded with hospital corners by the housekeeper who came twice a week. He walked past the great room, where Vanessa's cashmere throw was draped on the back of the sofa, smelling faintly of her perfume. He walked past the kitchen, where a single coffee cup sat in the sink, and he knew without looking that the lipstick on the rim was Eloise's color, a soft, natural rose, not Vanessa's red. He stopped at the doorway of the nursery. Eloise had fallen asleep in the rocking chair again. Sophia was curled against her chest, one small hand fisted in the collar of Eloise's pajama shirt. The book had slid to the floor. The lamp on the dresser cast its warm gold light across both of them, and Luca stood in the doorway for a long time, his hand braced against the frame, and he did something he had not done since the night his father died. He let himself feel it. All of it. The 3 years of restraint. The 14 months of guilt. The look on Eloise's face when she had thought he was losing everything, and the way her first reaction had not been to ask about her own job, but to offer him her savings. He closed his eyes. He did not cry. Luca Moretti had not cried since he was 11 years old. But he stood in that doorway and let himself understand, for the first time in his entire adult life, that the only thing he had ever truly been afraid of was the moment he was going to lose her. And he had almost lost her tonight, to a lie he had told himself was a test, and to a woman who would have sold every soul in this house for a passport and a beach house in Lisbon. He whispered her name, very quietly. Eloise. She did not wake up. He pulled a soft cashmere blanket from the back of the rocking chair and tucked it around both of them. He turned off the lamp. And then he went to his study and sat at his desk in the dark until the sun came up over the river, planning the destruction of Vanessa Cole down to the last syllable. At 10 the next morning, Eloise knocked on the door of his study. She was wearing a soft navy cardigan over a white t-shirt and her dark wash jeans, and her honey blonde hair was in its usual braid, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that told him she had not slept well either. Come in, he said. She closed the door behind her and sat down in the leather chair across from his desk, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Eloise, Luca said. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen until I'm finished. She nodded, her gray-blue eyes wide and steady. I'm not bankrupt, he said. Her lips parted slightly. I faked it. The seizure, the filings, all of it. I had reason to believe Vanessa was passing information to a federal prosecutor named Daniel Hayes. I needed to see what she would do when she thought the money was gone. Eloise stared at him. The color slowly drained from her round, soft cheeks. She spent the night with him last night, Luca said. At the Mandarin Oriental. I have photographs. There was a long silence. Then Eloise said, very quietly, why are you telling me this? Luca took a long breath. Because I should have told you a lot of things, a long time ago. And because there's something I need your help with, and I will not lie to you to get it. Not the way I lied to her. Eloise sat very still. Her hands were trembling in her lap. What do you need? Luca leaned forward, his forearms on the desk, his dark eyes locked on hers. I need to know what she's been telling him. I have men watching her, but Vanessa doesn't talk in front of men. She talks in front of women she thinks are beneath her. She talks in front of the help. He paused. She talks in front of you, Eloise. And she's been talking in front of you for 14 months. I need you to think back. I need you to tell me everything she's ever said in this penthouse that didn't sound right. Eloise was quiet for a very long time. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray March sky over the Hudson. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Steadier. Sharper. Like a woman who had been waiting a long time to be asked the right question. Luca, she said. I've been keeping a notebook. The notebook was a small leather moleskine that Eloise kept hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Velveteen Rabbit on the bookshelf in the nursery. She brought it down to his study 15 minutes later, her hand shaking slightly as she placed it on his desk. I started writing things down about a year ago, she said quietly. I didn't know what to do with them. I'm a nanny. I'm not, I don't have anyone to tell. I just kept writing. In case it mattered. In case Sophia ever needed me to remember. Luca opened the notebook. His daughter's nanny had filled 40 pages in her neat, looping handwriting. Dates. Times. Verbatim quotes. Names. License plates. The name Daniel Hayes appeared on page 6. The name appeared again on pages 11, 17, 23, 31, and 38. Vanessa had been on the phone with Hayes in front of Eloise dozens of times. She had referred to him as Danny. She had mentioned, in front of Eloise, a safe deposit box at a Chase branch on 57th Street. She had mentioned, on a Tuesday in November, that Luca keeps everything in the floor under the bar cart in the office. She had laughed, on a Sunday in January, about how easy it was going to be. I didn't understand most of it at the time, Eloise said. I thought she was having an affair. I thought maybe Danny was a man she was seeing. I didn't know he was a prosecutor until you said his name just now. Luca closed the notebook. His hands were perfectly still on the leather cover, but inside his chest, something was happening that had not happened in 15 years. He was afraid. Not of Vanessa. Not of Hayes. He was afraid of how close he had come to losing the woman standing in front of him. Because if Vanessa had succeeded, if she had gotten the contents of the safe and walked them into Hayes' office, the indictments would not have stopped at Luca. They would have swept up everyone. Carmine. The Capos. The legitimate employees of the construction company. And eventually, the federal investigators would have looked at the household. At the nanny who had been in the penthouse for 3 years. At Eloise Bennett, 29, no criminal record, master's degree from Columbia, paid in cash. They would have made her testify. They would have ruined her. And she had been writing it all down. To protect his daughter. Without asking him for anything. For a year. He turned the pages slowly, reading entries at random. October 14, 9:47 p.m. V on phone in kitchen, says he doesn't suspect anything, he's too busy with the docs. October 22, 3:15 p.m. V in great room with friend Marissa, says once I have what I need, I'm done. 6 more months. November 3, 11:02 p.m. V on phone, mentions a name, sounds like Hayes or Hayes. November 19, 8:30 a.m. V in kitchen on burner phone, says the safe is under the bar cart, I just need the combination, I'll get it. Page after page after page. The handwriting got steadier as the entries went on, as if Eloise had grown more certain, over time, that what she was writing down was real. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. D on phone in master bath. Says, it's almost over. I'll be on a plane by April. You and I, somewhere quiet. Then she laughed. Luca closed the notebook. He looked up at Eloise. She was still standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the river as if she could not bear to watch his face while he read. Eloise, he said. She turned her head, just slightly. How did you know? He said quietly. How did you know it was worth writing down? You're a nanny. You have a master's in early childhood development. None of this is your world. How did you know? Eloise was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very softly, because the first month I worked here, Luca, I read every article I could find about the Moretti family. I'm not stupid. I knew what I was walking into. I told myself, if I'm going to take care of this little girl, I am going to keep my eyes open. For her. Not for the FBI. Not for a newspaper. For Sophia. So that if anything ever went wrong, I would know what had happened. And I would be able to tell her, when she was old enough, the truth about her family. She paused. Her voice dropped. And then, after about 6 months, I realized I was also doing it for you. Eloise, Luca said. He stood up slowly. He walked around the desk. She turned to face him, and her gray-blue eyes were full of tears that she was refusing to let fall. Look at me, he said softly. She looked up. He was very close to her now. Close enough to smell the vanilla and laundry detergent in her hair. Close enough to see the dimple that appeared when she pressed her lips together to keep from crying. Why did you keep this? He said. Why didn't you take it to the police? Why didn't you take it to a reporter? You could have gotten paid. You could have walked away. Eloise's chin lifted. There was something fierce in her face that he had only ever seen when someone tried to talk to Sophia in a voice she didn't like. Because Sophia trusts me, she whispered. And because you, she stopped. Her voice cracked. She looked down at the floor. Because I, say it, Luca said. His voice was so quiet it was almost a breath. Eloise. Please. Say it. She closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and slid down her round cheek. Because I love your daughter, she whispered. And because I have loved you since the day you sat down on the nursery floor next to me and asked me how to braid her hair. The silence in the study was the loudest sound Luca Moretti had ever heard. He lifted his hand. Very slowly. He cupped the side of her face with his palm, his thumb wiping the tear from the soft slope of her cheek. She did not pull away. She leaned into his hand, just slightly, like a woman who had been starving for 14 months and finally allowed herself one bite. Eloise, he said. I am going to fix this. All of it. And then I am going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for every minute I spent looking at the wrong woman in this house. She opened her eyes. They were full of something so warm and so terrified that he almost couldn't bear it. What are you going to do? She whispered. Luca's hand slid from her cheek down to the soft curve of her shoulder. He stepped back, just slightly. There would be time for the rest. There would be time for everything. But first there was work to do. I'm going to give her exactly what she wants, he said. And then I'm going to take it all back. The trap was set over the next 9 days. Carmine handled the logistics. The contents of the floor safe under the bar cart in Luca's office were replaced with a stack of documents so beautifully forged that they would have fooled the men who printed money for the treasury. The documents listed offshore accounts, shell companies, names of corrupt judges, and shipping manifests for cocaine that had never actually moved through the port of Newark. Every single piece of paper was a lie. Every single name on the documents was a federal agent, a deceased capo, or a person who did not exist. If Hayes built a case on those documents, his case would collapse in court within a week and his career would collapse with it. Luca made sure Vanessa discovered the new combination to the safe by leaving a sticky note in his sock drawer on a Sunday morning while she was watching him get dressed. He made sure she had a 40-minute window on Wednesday afternoon, when he was supposedly meeting with bankruptcy attorneys downtown, to open the safe and photograph everything inside. During those 9 days, Luca did something he had not done since the very early days of his father's reign. He went to ground. He cancelled meetings. He stopped taking phone calls after 6 in the evening. He spent his evenings at home, in the penthouse, eating dinner at the kitchen table with his daughter and the nanny who had quietly saved his life. He told Vanessa, when she asked, that he was depressed about the bankruptcy. That he could not bear to see anyone. She accepted this without argument, because it suited her, because every evening she spent away from the penthouse was another evening she could spend with Daniel Hayes. What Luca was actually doing, in those 9 evenings, was watching Eloise feed his daughter spaghetti and cut grapes into careful quarters and read picture books in 3 different voices. He was learning the shape of her hands. He was learning the way she laughed, low and warm, when Sophia said something accidentally hilarious. He was learning that when she thought no one was watching, Eloise would press a small kiss to the top of Sophia's head and whisper something that he could not quite hear. He learned, on the 7th evening, that the thing she whispered was, "You are so loved, baby. You are so, so loved." He had to leave the kitchen that night and stand in his dark study for 10 minutes before he trusted himself to come back. He had spent 3 years telling himself that Eloise was just an employee. He understood now that Eloise had been raising his daughter as if she were her own. And his daughter, who had not allowed Vanessa to touch her in 14 months, had been letting Eloise braid her hair every single morning, because Sophia, 2.5 years old, had understood from the very first week which woman in the penthouse actually loved her. Eloise watched Vanessa do it. From the doorway of the nursery, with Sophia asleep on her shoulder, Eloise watched Vanessa Cole kneel on the floor of the office and photograph every page of every document with a small black phone that she pulled from inside her bra. Eloise did not move. She did not breathe. She had a small audio recorder in the pocket of her cardigan, and it was running the entire time. When Vanessa finally stood up, closed the safe, and walked out of the office, she did not see the nanny in the nursery doorway. Vanessa Cole had never once, in 14 months of living in the penthouse, actually looked at Eloise Bennett. That was the mistake that ended her. Vanessa met Daniel Hayes that night at a wine bar in the West Village. She gave him the phone. She told him, in a voice that was caught on 3 different surveillance microphones that Carmine had placed in the booth 2 days earlier, that this was everything. That Luca kept it all in one place because he was arrogant. That she wanted the witness protection deal they had discussed, and she wanted it in writing by Friday, and she wanted $1 million and a new identity in Lisbon. Hayes told her she would have it all. He thanked her for her service to the United States government. He kissed her, briefly, on the mouth. And then he walked out of the wine bar with the phone in his pocket and got into a federal sedan that was waiting at the curb. Carmine called Luca at 11:45 that night. "It's done, boss." She handed it over. "We have audio. We have video. We have everything." Luca was standing in the nursery doorway. Eloise was in the rocking chair, asleep, with Sophia curled against her chest. The lamp on the dresser was the only light in the room. He stared at the two of them for a long moment. Then he said, into the phone, "Bring her home tomorrow morning. Tell her I want to apologize. Tell her I've decided to take a meeting with a Russian about a loan. Tell her there might be a way to save the family. Tell her I need her." Carmine was quiet for a moment. And then, Luca said softly, "She's going to find out exactly what kind of man she tried to destroy." Vanessa came home at 10 the next morning. She walked into the penthouse in a cream-colored cashmere coat and a pair of sunglasses that hid her eyes, and she found Luca sitting at the dining room table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood up when she walked in. He pulled out a chair for her. He poured her a cup of coffee from the silver pot. He told her, in a voice that was soft and exhausted and apologetic, that he had spoken to a man in Brighton Beach the night before and that there was a chance, a real chance, that the family could be saved if she was willing to stand by him through one more difficult month. Vanessa smiled. She reached across the table and took his hand. She told him that of course she would stand by him. That she loved him. That they would get through this together. Luca looked at her for a very long moment. And then he said, quietly, Vanessa. There's someone I want you to meet. I think you've actually met her before. But I don't think you've ever really seen her. Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly. What are you talking about, Luca? Luca turned his head toward the hallway. Eloise, he said. Would you come in here please? Eloise walked into the dining room. She was wearing a soft burgundy sweater dress that draped over her full curves and a pair of black ankle boots, and her honey blonde hair was loose around her shoulders for the first time in 3 years. She was holding the small audio recorder in one hand and the leather moleskine notebook in the other. She set them both down on the dining room table between Luca and Vanessa. She did not sit down. She looked Vanessa cold directly in the eyes for the first time in 14 months. And then, in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly steady, the nanny who had spent a year writing down every secret that the woman of the house had let slip in front of the help, said, Hi, Vanessa. I'm Eloise. I take care of Sophia. I also know about Danny. And the safe deposit box at the Chase on 57th. And the conversation you had on the kitchen phone in November about the floor safe under the bar cart. And the night last August when you stood in the kitchen in your robe and told Daniel Hayes that if Luca ever found out, he would, and I am quoting you directly from page 11, kill me and bury me in a foundation slab in Long Island City. Vanessa's coffee cup hit the table so hard that the saucer cracked. For a long moment, Vanessa did not speak. Her eyes moved from Eloise's face, to the notebook, to the audio recorder, to Luca, and back to Eloise. Luca could see it happening behind her green eyes. The same calculation he had seen on the night he told her the bankruptcy was real. She was running through every conversation she had ever had in the penthouse with Eloise in the room. She was counting how many times Eloise had brought her a cup of tea while she was on the phone with Hayes. How many times Eloise had walked past her in the kitchen while she was complaining about Luca to Marissa. How many times Eloise had stood 3 feet away from her with Sophia on her hip while she lied about where she had been the night before. Vanessa was understanding, all at once, that she had spent 14 months performing for the wrong audience. The audience she had thought did not matter, because the audience was a fat nanny in a cardigan, had been the only audience that mattered the entire time. What happened next, Luca would remember for the rest of his life. Not because of what Vanessa did. Vanessa did the predictable thing. She screamed. She lunged across the table at Eloise. She called Eloise names that Luca would later make a man pay for in a basement in Queens. What Luca would remember was Eloise. Eloise did not flinch. She did not step back. She caught Vanessa's wrist mid-strike with a calm, firm grip, and she said, in the same gentle voice she used to tell Sophia that it was time to put the crayons away, Vanessa. Sit down. Sophia is napping. We do not raise our voices in this house. And Vanessa Cole, who had been the most beautiful and most polished and most lethal woman in the penthouse for 14 months, sat down. Carmine and 2 of the Moretti capos came out of the kitchen at that moment. They had been waiting in the pantry for the last hour. Vanessa was on her feet again immediately, demanding to know what was happening, demanding her phone, demanding a lawyer. Luca stood up from the table. He buttoned the jacket of his charcoal suit. He looked at the woman he had lived with for 14 months and felt absolutely nothing. Vanessa, he said. The bankruptcy was a test. Everything you photographed in the safe was a lie. The documents you handed to Daniel Hayes last night are going to end his career by the end of next week, because 3 of the names on those manifests are federal agents who are currently working active assignments in the Southern District, and Hayes is going to be charged with leaking classified federal personnel records to a foreign asset. That foreign asset, Vanessa, is going to be you. Because in the last 48 hours, my men have moved $60,000 in cash and a Portuguese passport into your storage unit in Long Island City. The FBI is going to find them tomorrow morning, after they receive an anonymous tip from a concerned citizen. Vanessa's face went white. Luca. Please. You are going to walk out of this penthouse today, Luca said quietly. You are going to take nothing with you. The jewelry stays. The clothes stay. The bracelet on your wrist stays. You are going to disappear, Vanessa, before the FBI comes for Daniel Hayes, because if they find you with him, you are going to spend the next 30 years in a federal prison in West Virginia. And if you ever come back to this city, if you ever come within 100 miles of my daughter or the woman standing next to me, I will make sure they never find your body. He paused. Carmine. Get her out of my house. Carmine took her arm. Vanessa was crying now, real tears, ugly ones, the kind of tears Luca had not seen on her perfectly contoured face in 14 months. She looked back at him from the doorway of the dining room. Luca, she whispered. You're throwing me out for the fat nanny. Luca turned his head slowly. He looked at her with eyes that had gone completely flat and completely dead. Her name, he said, is Eloise Bennett. And she is the smartest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever met in my life. And you are not fit to say her name. The door of the penthouse closed behind Vanessa Cole at 10:47 on a Friday morning in late March. She would board a plane to Lisbon that night under a name that was not on any passport, and she would never set foot in the city of New York again. The silence in the dining room afterward was enormous. Eloise was still standing by the table, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was leaving her body. Luca crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not touch her at first. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to look at him, and he said, very quietly, Eloise. Are you all right? She nodded. Her gray-blue eyes were full of tears again. She whispered, I've never spoken to anyone that way in my life. You were perfect, he said. You were absolutely perfect. And then he could not stop himself anymore. He lifted both his hands to her face, cradling her round cheeks in his palms, and he kissed her. The kiss was not what either of them had expected. It was not the explosive, devouring kiss of a mafia boss who had finally claimed his prize. It was slow. It was reverent. It was the kiss of a man who had waited 3 years to taste something he had been afraid to want, and who could not quite believe that he was finally allowed. Eloise made a small soft sound against his mouth, and her hands came up to rest on the lapels of his suit jacket, and she kissed him back. She kissed him back like a woman who had been writing his name in the margins of her notebook for a year. When he finally pulled back, he kept his forehead pressed to hers. His hands had slid down to her waist, settling on the soft generous curve of her hips through the burgundy dress, and his thumbs were moving slowly against the fabric like he was memorizing the shape of her. I have loved you, he said quietly, since the second week you worked here. When I came home at 3 in the morning from a bad meeting and you were asleep in the rocking chair with Sophia on your chest, and you had a children's book open on your lap, and you looked up at me with those eyes, and you smiled, and you said, she missed her dad. And I stood in that doorway, Eloise, and I thought, I am going to ruin this woman's life if I am not very, very careful. Eloise let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob. Luca. I was a coward, he said. I told myself you were too good. I told myself you deserved a kindergarten teacher named Brian who lived in Park Slope and made you pancakes on Sundays. I told myself I would destroy you. So I brought another woman into this house instead, and I let her sleep in a bed I should have been begging you to share, and I watched you raise my daughter for 3 years while I pretended I did not see you. Eloise. I am so sorry. Eloise lifted her hands. She cupped his jaw the way he had cupped her face a moment before. Luca Moretti, she whispered. I do not want a kindergarten teacher named Brian. A slow, broken smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. No. No, she said. I want the man who sat down on the nursery floor with me 3 years ago and asked me how to braid his daughter's hair. I want the man who pays me in cash because he is trying to protect me from his own world. I want the man who is standing in front of me right now. His hands tightened on her waist. Eloise. I have been yours, Luca, she said quietly, since the first month. I was just waiting for you to be ready. The second kiss was not slow. The second kiss was 3 years of restraint breaking at once. He pulled her flush against him, his arm wrapping around the small of her back, his other hand sliding up into her honey blonde hair, and he kissed her like a man who had finally come home. Eloise melted against him, her soft generous body fitting against his hard frame like she had been carved to belong there. He groaned into her mouth at the feel of her, at the warm plush curve of her chest against his ribs, at the way her hands fisted in the front of his shirt. From the hallway, a small sleepy voice said, "Daddy." They broke apart, both breathless. Sophia was standing in the doorway of the dining room in her pink pajamas, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear, her dark curls a wild halo around her sleepy face. She looked at her father. She looked at her nanny. She looked at the fact that her father's hand was still resting on her nanny's hip. And then Sophia, 2.5 years old, said the thing that broke Luca Moretti completely. "Are you and Lua going to get married now?" Eloise made a soft sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. Luca crouched down. He held out his arms. Sophia ran across the dining room and threw herself into his chest, and he stood up with her, settling her on his hip, and he held out his other arm. Eloise stepped into it. He pulled her against his side, his arm wrapping around her waist, his daughter on his other hip, and he kissed the top of Eloise's head. "Yes, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Eventually. If Lua says yes. We're going to do this the right way." Eloise looked up at him with shining eyes. "The right way," she whispered. "The right way," he said. "I am going to take you to dinner, Eloise Bennett. I am going to take you on actual dates. I am going to bring you flowers like a man who deserves you. I am going to spend the next year showing you exactly what it looks like when Luca Moretti loves a woman properly. And then, when you are ready, and not 1 minute before, I am going to ask you a question." Eloise's dimple appeared in her left cheek. "And what if I'm ready in 6 months?" Luca smiled. It was the first real smile he had given anyone other than his daughter in 3 years. "Then I'll be ready in 5. Sophia, who had been listening to all of this with the grave attention of a small philosopher, patted her father's cheek and said, "I want pancakes." And so the head of the Moretti crime family, who had that morning destroyed the woman who had tried to destroy him, walked into his kitchen with his daughter on one hip and the woman he had loved in silence for 3 years tucked under his arm, and he made pancakes. Daniel Hayes was arrested 4 days later on charges of leaking classified federal personnel records. His career ended in a perp walk on the steps of the federal courthouse in Foley Square. The story made the front page of the New York Post under the headline "Fed Fall from Grace," and Luca read it at the kitchen table with Eloise sitting across from him in one of his old Columbia sweatshirts, her hair still damp from the shower, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that had been in the penthouse since before Vanessa moved in. She read the article over his shoulder, her hand resting on the back of his neck, and when she finished she kissed the top of his head and said, very quietly, "Is it over?" "It's over," he said. He reached up and caught her hand and pressed it to his mouth. "It is so completely over, Eloise." Vanessa Cole disappeared into the south of Portugal and was never heard from again, though Carmine Bellucci kept tabs on her for the rest of his life, just in case. The Moretti construction empire was never bankrupt. The penthouse on Hudson Street stayed exactly where it was. Eloise Bennett kept her job as Sophia's nanny for exactly 2 more months, until Luca took her to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village on a warm night in May and told her, over a shared plate of cacio e pepe, that he had hired a second nanny for daytime help and that he would like, very much, if she would consider being something more than an employee in his home. Eloise said yes, in a voice so quiet he had to lean across the table to hear her, and then she said yes again, louder, and then she laughed and cried at the same time, and the waiter brought them champagne on the house even though they hadn't ordered any. The months that followed were the strangest and the happiest of Luca Moretti's life. He had never properly courted a woman before. With Vanessa, it had been transactional from the beginning, a series of expensive dinners that had ended in a series of expected outcomes. With Eloise, everything was new. He brought her flowers on a Tuesday for no reason. He took her to the Met on a Saturday afternoon and walked her slowly through the European paintings, and when she stopped in front of a Vermeer and went quiet, he watched her face for a full minute before he said anything, because he did not want to interrupt whatever was happening behind her gray-blue eyes. He took her to a small jazz club on Sullivan Street where the lights were low and the saxophone player knew his name, and he held her hand under the table while she listened to the music with her head tilted and her dimple flickering. He took her shopping at a small boutique in Soho, where the owner, a woman named Antonella who had dressed Luca's mother 30 years before, brought out dress after dress in Eloise's size, in deep emerald and burgundy and midnight blue, and Luca sat on a velvet bench with his elbows on his knees and watched Eloise come out of the dressing room and forgot, every single time, how to breathe. He learned that she liked her coffee with a single spoon of brown sugar and a splash of oat milk. He learned that she cried at insurance commercials and laughed so hard at slapstick comedies that she snorted, which embarrassed her and which Luca found so devastatingly endearing that he started playing her old Three Stooges clips on his phone just to hear it happen. He learned that she had a younger brother in Ohio who worked at a hardware store, and he flew the brother to New York for Thanksgiving, and the brother sat at the dining room table where Vanessa had once cracked a saucer and ate 3 helpings of stuffing while Sophia climbed into his lap and called him Uncle Mikey within the first hour. He learned, slowly, what it felt like to be loved by a woman who had nothing to gain from him. He learned, slowly, that it felt like coming home. They were married 11 months later, on a warm afternoon in April, in the garden of a small villa on the Amalfi Coast. Sophia, 3 years old by then, walked down the aisle in a white dress and threw rose petals with the focused intensity of a small Italian general. Eloise wore a simple ivory gown that draped over her soft generous curves and a single strand of pearls that had belonged to Luca's grandmother. Carmine Bellucci gave the bride away, because Eloise's father had passed years before, and Carmine had quietly informed Luca 6 months earlier that he would consider it the honor of his life. When Luca finally lifted Eloise's veil and looked into her gray-blue eyes, he thought of the night he had sat in his dark study staring at the river and felt the cold clarity of a man who had been betrayed. And he thought of the next morning, when a soft, brave, brilliant woman had walked into his study and put a small leather notebook on his desk and saved his entire family without ever asking for a single thing in return. "Eloise," he whispered, just before he kissed her. "Yes," she whispered back. "I would have walked away from all of it for you. The whole empire. Everything. The day you put that notebook on my desk. I would have walked away." Her dimple appeared. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I never asked you to." He kissed her then, in front of his daughter and his oldest friend and a small crowd of weeping Italians, and for the first time in his entire life, the boss of the Moretti family understood what it actually meant to win. That night, after the reception, after the toasts and the dancing and Sophia falling asleep in a chair with frosting on her chin, Luca carried his new wife up the stone staircase of the villa to the bedroom on the top floor, where the windows opened over the dark Mediterranean and the breeze smelled like lemon trees. He set her down very carefully on the edge of the 4-poster bed. He knelt in front of her on the cool tile floor. He took her hands in his and pressed them to his mouth, and he said, in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him, "I am going to spend the rest of my life thanking you, Eloise. For Sophia. For me. For every page of that notebook. For the night you offered me your savings when you thought I was bankrupt. For every single morning of the last 3 years that I did not deserve and that you gave me anyway." Eloise lifted his face with her hands. Her gray-blue eyes were wet. "Luca," she whispered. "You already have. You have been thanking me since the day you sat down on the nursery floor and asked me how to braid her hair. You just didn't know that's what you were doing." She bent her head and kissed him, slow and sweet, and the new Mrs. Moretti tasted like champagne and lemon cake and the warm Italian night, and the boss of the Moretti family, who had begun his year by burying one woman in a lie, ended it by burying his face against the soft warm curve of his wife's neck and weeping, very quietly, with gratitude. If this story of a ruthless mafia boss finally seeing the brilliant, beautiful woman who had been right under his nose the entire time made your heart race, you know what to do. Hit that like button right now if you cheered when Eloise put that notebook on the desk. Drop a comment and tell me which moment got you, the kiss in the dining room, Sophia asking if they were getting married, or the pancakes. Share this story with a friend who believes that the quiet woman in the corner is always the one paying attention. And subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, because we drop a brand new Mafia romance every single week, and the next one is going to wreck you in all the best ways. I'll see you in the next story.